You're in a conflict with someone you love, and in the middle, you notice something. You're responding the way your father or mother responded. The exact same shutdown or rage, the exact same escalation, the exact same retreat into silence, or the same flood of words that fills every available space. You swore you would never be like that. And you understand where it came from, and you may have been spending years in therapy dealing with this. And yet, there it is. And in that moment, working harder on yourself feels beside the point. Or you feel it as a quiet recognition, anxiety, grief, a response to pressure that seems disproportionate to anything in your own history. Something is running that doesn't feel entirely self generated. Today on Ask Dr. Gill, I want to talk about what is happening in those moments, and I want to discuss how patterns are inherited. So stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Ask Dr. Gill. I am your host, Dr. Gill Winkleman, and this episode is about moments where you act without really understanding where that might be coming from. I want to establish something at the very beginning, which I'm going to return to at the end of this episode, which is that understanding that a pattern is inherited doesn't make it less yours to work with. If anything, it might make it more workable because you have a distance from it and you're stopped trying to fix something that really was never broken in the first place. And you start working on the completion of something that wasn't completed before you were born in some cases. And that reframe is where this episode is going. But first, we need to understand what we're working with. Some patterns arrive and they're already running, and not because of something that happened to you, but because of what happened before you. So let's talk about where this might be coming from. And there's three, I'll say, distinct explanations for inherited patterns because they're actually different and they come from different places. And if you intermix them, then you don't know how to deal with them quite very well. And so what we don't want to do is overclaim something that isn't necessarily there and dismiss something that is. So each mechanism is real and a possibility, and each has a different evidence base. Each points to different types of interventions too. So the first mechanism is the most obvious one, which is learned behavior through family modeling. This is what you absorb by watching people around you before you, and oftentimes it's before you had language to even understand what you were seeing. The second mechanism is nervous system conditioning. This is the relational environment you were raised in. And that can shape your physiological settings before you have the capacity to observe or choose what your settings are. And the third is epigenetic. This is the stress responses in previous generations that appear, and they leave biological marks that alter how you express things in future generations. And it's not the memory necessarily, but it's the biology or the biological terrain. Now, these are different experiences. And if you carry the pattern that predates your conscious history, it may feel similar across all three of those mechanisms, but what you're working with and what kind of intervention actually reaches it depends on which one is primary. So I want to go into each three of these in more detail. I want to also mention something, there's a dimension that I'll mention at the end, which is a clinical observation, but doesn't reduce to any of the three mechanisms. And I'll hold that for now, but I want that you to be aware of it as we're discussing this. Okay, so the first mechanism is one of learned behavior and family modeling. The most common form of this is also the least mysterious once you see it. Before you had language, or even sometimes after you had language, you were conducting a continuous and detailed study of how the adults around you lived. And that could include how they manage fear, how they manage conflict, how they related to money, to intimacy, to uncertainty, how they got their own needs met, and whether need was okay to have, whether anger was allowed, whether rest was earned or simply given, whether the world was fundamentally safe or fundamentally threatening. This is not anything you decided. You just absorbed this. You absorbed it through language, through immersion, through repetition, and your nervous system's drive to model what it observes. This resulted in templates, internal working models of how relationship works, how emotions are safe, what emotions are safe to feel, what kind of person you need to be loved, connected, and safe. Most of these templates are invisible to us because they are the proverbial fish in water. This is the reality rather than a learned interpretation. And the conflict moment from the opening is this mechanism in action. You didn't choose your father's shutdown or your mother's escalation. You observed it so many times in situations that carried so much charge, it became default. And this is what makes this mechanism distinct. It operates at a level of learned behavior, which means it responds to the same processes that is how we update our learned behavior. Pattern recognition, new relational experience, conscious practice of different responses, insight into what the template was protecting against. This is real work, and the template was learned, and it can also be updated. As an example, I love talking about driving. I remember my nephew started cussing when he was driving at other drivers. And where did he learn that? Well, from watching his dad, my brother. And so he lost his driving privileges and had to relearn that. Now, fortunately, he didn't have much experience driving before that. So it wasn't a big deal to relearn that. But if you've been doing that for 20 years, it's harder, right? And if any of you cuss while you drive or get angry at other drivers or criticize other drivers, you know what I'm talking about. And I use this as a simple example, but these are the things that we learn through, I'll say, osmosis. Now, the question to sit with for this mechanism is, what did you learn to do with the feelings that weren't welcome in the environment you grew up in? Not what you were told to do them, but what you actually learned to do. The second mechanism has to do with nervous system conditioning. And this goes deeper than observation. So the nervous system has baseline settings. And if you move out of those settings, oftentimes you feel unsafe because those settings are designed to register what is threatening and what is safe and have your body return quickly to a normal baseline. Now, some people have this flipped, by the way. Some people will feel unsafe unless they're activated, right? There's that possibility about this. And this all develops before there's any language, before we have memory, before we have any capacity for choice. The quality of attunement you received in your early years, how accurately and consistently the adults around you responded to your states, how predictable the relational environment was, whether your distress was met with regulation or with dysregulation, all of this shaped a baseline you've been running ever since. An example of this, a child who's distressed is consistently met with a caregiver's own anxiety rather than with calm will learn at a physiological layer, it's embedded in the nervous system, that distress produces more distress. that learning happens before you have language. And it means that the nervous system's working model of what emotional experience is different than someone who was soothed in that situation. And this mechanism explains several things that learned behavior doesn't account for. It explains why two children raised in the same household, learning the same behaviors from their parents, can have genuinely different nervous system baselines. Same parents, same households, same general environment, but the specific relational attunement each child received was different enough that one carries significantly more chronic activation than another. And it wasn't what they learned to do, it was rather how their physiology developed in terms of that attunement. And I've seen this a lot in my practice. I've seen this with twins and how their response to different situations and how their parents treated them was different. It explains why insight alone doesn't shift the deepest physiological presentations. You can understand very precisely why your nervous system runs the way it does, and on its own, that insight doesn't return you to your baseline. The baseline was set through relational experience, and it will update through relational experience. The revision requires the same medium as the original learning. And it explains why some patterns feel pre-verbal, because they are. They were set before language arrival, which is part of why language alone doesn't fully reach them. The inherited dimension here is indirect. What the previous generation passed to this generation wasn't their biology directly. It was their relational environment that their own nervous system created. And that environment shaped your baseline in this generation. That transmission happened through lived experience, not genetic inheritance. And that is an important distinction for what comes next. I'm going to take a quick break, and then on the second half of the show, we're going to talk about the epigenetic aspect of this. So stay tuned. Hello, and welcome back to Ask Dr. Gill. I am your host, Dr. Gill Winkelman, and today on the podcast, we're talking about inherited patterns. Now, I've mentioned two of the mechanisms. One is just learned behavior, and that's where we learn a lot of the things that we do, whether we respond to text right away or we wait days to respond to text, or how we drive, or how we relate to people, and the things we say and the mannerisms that we say them. And we also have this nervous system pattern that came through how our caregivers attuned or didn't attune to us and where our nervous system baseline is set. And that requires more attunement, more proper attunement to get to the new level of how you attune with somebody. The third mechanism is different. It's epigenetic. And often it produces a lot of confusion, and sometimes there's overclaiming with it, and there's often a lot of dismissal. sometimes simultaneously. So before we jump into it, let me kind of explain what this is. So epigenetics, and I've talked about this on the show before, and there's a podcast about epigenetics specifically. In fact, I believe I do have a YouTube video because I go through sort of some of the diagrams in it as well. So epigenetics is the study of how people's genes express and how they're regulated, which is separate from the underlying DNA sequence. When you look at the DNA in a human being, and the analogy I like to give is if you took all the railroad tracks in the United States and wound them up into a ball and shoved them into a 10 by 10 room, that's basically what our DNA is doing. So if you want to use something, you have to unroll it. And epigenetics determines what gets unrolled and what doesn't get unrolled. It's not simply that they're on or off. It's the markers that are there and how they respond to the environment, to stress, to nutrition, to various factors, basically everything that we experience in our life. Going back to the trains for a minute. So let's assume that you have to unroll the track and re-roll it every time you're using it, right? And if you're going on a particular route a lot, you're going to leave that track out or you're going to tag it. This track is used a lot. Whereas if you have a track that you don't use a lot, say, LA to Wichita, Kansas, as an example. Well, we don't, if we don't use that train track a lot, we're going to tag it as, hey, don't use this very often. Well, those tags get passed from generation to generation. And what that's called is epigenetics. With that in mind, there's definite research that supports that these patterns, as epigenetic patterns, get passed from generation to generation. There's a particular study, there's two particular studies I want to point out. One is the Dutch hunger winter studies, which has been replicated. And there was a severe famine in the Netherlands in 1944 and 1945. Thousands of the people experienced extreme hunger and nutritional deprivation. The children born to mothers who were pregnant during this famine showed measurable physiological differences, altered metabolic function, increased rates of certain health conditions, and these persisted for decades. And their children showed some of these differences too, even though there was no famine, and the famine had ended by the time their children were born. Now, there's a similar study shown with survivors of the Holocaust, and their offspring found differences in cortisol regulation compared to demographically matched controls. It's not about memories, by the way. It's not the psychological content. It's measurable differences in how the stress system is calibrated. Animal studies, particularly with work with rats, has found these patterns as well. And they find that the epigenetic markers are different. So what the research does not support is equally important to state. The inheritance of specific memories, of specific emotional contents, or psychological substance of what a previous generation experienced, the mechanism appears to operate at a physiological susceptibility, and there's altered thresholds in terms of stress responses or nervous system states. But your grandmother's grief did not get transmitted to you necessarily as grief through this mechanism. What may have been transmitted is the biological terrain that makes your grief more readily activated, more persistent, or harder to regulate. I mean, the other piece to this is that sometimes the grief that we get that our parents or grandparents had, we get through their expression of it, right? That's the learned behavior. But that's not what the epigenetic studies are showing. So I just want to make that clear. Why this matters clinically is epigenetic susceptibility is part of what you're working with. the intervention isn't necessarily psychological, it's physiological. And the work at this layer often involves addressing the biology and the terrain of the body, as opposed to the psychology. We need to look at the nervous system regulation, nutritional support, chronic activation at the level where it lives, as well as the psychological and relational work, because obviously there's an intertwinement in these examples. Understanding this can reframe why the psychological work alone creates a ceiling for many people. So the meaning and the narrative layer, I want to name one more dimension here. And I want to be clear from the beginning that this one sits outside the territory where I can point to an established mechanism. It's more of a clinical observation, not a scientific study. In family systems work and depth-oriented approaches, depth psychological work, there's a consistent clinical observation that doesn't reduce cleanly to nervous system conditioning or learned behavior or epigenetics. And it's the observation that some patterns seem to carry meaning. In other words, they're organized not around the biology or the relationship necessarily, but around a narrative. As if the pattern is a story that's running before the person even arrived, and they stepped into it without even knowing they stepped into it. I'll give you an example from my clinical work. I had a patient, we'll just call her Sarah, that I'd been working for a long time, who had this really pervasive, and she couldn't understand why she had this, so we'll call it a sourceless grief. It wasn't depression. She had a quality of feeling loss that she couldn't locate in her history. In the course of working with her, we learned that her grandmother had lost a child as an infant before Sarah's mother was born. And it was never spoken about, and there was no photographs. It had been organized to make it invisible. When Sarah found out about this and named that she had basically been carrying her grandmother's unmourned grief, I don't know exactly what happened, but something shifted. And eventually that whole grief process transformed. It was like this constant companion just left. I don't know what the mechanism is. I don't even know how the grief may have been transmitted epigenetically, or if it was transmitted, or if it was just learned, and just understanding it helped her release it. There's definitely something that happens in our relational field or our family field that I don't know if any of the three mechanisms I've been talking about necessarily can address or name. And I think understanding it, though, and understanding these pieces there's a dimension that helps us release whatever the pattern is that we've stepped into, whatever the inherited story it is, the narrative. Naming it as such doesn't require certainty about the mechanism. It requires honesty about what it is that happened. And I think oftentimes families hold these secrets and don't talk about it, and they do get passed on. I'm going to leave you with three questions. Is there a pattern in your life that you feel maybe isn't self-generated? Something that you've picked up over the years from your family, from your system? And is it something that arrived before you did, or that you're recognizing from the previous generations? In terms of the three mechanisms that I mentioned, which resonates most with the pattern? The learned templates from watching other people, your nervous system based state before you had language, or is there something that goes back further in your lineage? And lastly, what would it mean to be the one who completes it? How would that feel? Understanding that pattern is inherited doesn't mean that there's no work involved. It changes your relationship to it, though. And it's not something that you're fixing about what happened to you necessarily or something that's wrong in you. It's completing something that happened before you even arrived. And this is a different orientation to work with. In my experience, the second one tends to produce different results, not because the pattern changes immediately, but because the person stops fighting with themselves and starts working with what's there. Next week, we'll talk about actual changes when the nervous system finally calms down. So thank you for joining me today. And if you haven't taken the Healing Archetype quiz, check it out and check out the offerings that I have. Particularly once you take the quiz, there are different placements, I will say, where different types of treatments are really helpful. And I think it's important if you're trying to heal to understand that. So thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time.